Okay, today we're going to change a water pump on a 2001 Jeep Cherokee, Grand Cherokee. It's a 4.0 liter. Here's what we're working with here. If you're pretty good with basic hand tools, it's a relatively simple job. We're going to start off by draining the coolant, which is pretty easy to do on this. You look down in here, you'll have the drain valve on the radiator right there. Little length of hose into a bucket. Open that drain valve, drain all the coolant out. That's step one. Okay, first thing you want to do is disconnect your battery. Even though we're not doing anything electrical, we always want to disconnect our battery just in case somebody decides to jump in the truck, try to start it up. You don't want your hands in there when that happens. So we'll disconnect the battery first thing. Then you're going to take your upper radiator hose off. Take your overflow hose off of here. Get that out of your way. Next step, disconnect your fan electrical. If you're not familiar with these connectors, there's a red tab that has to be slid sideways before you can push the button in. After that's done, there's 4 bolts, one there, one up here, and then this guy that's hidden way down there on your fan. 3 of the uppers and the one lower on the passenger side are fairly easy to get out. I'm going to show you how to take the bottom one out on the driver's side. Okay, your lower bolt was ever so nicely buried under here by the engineers at Jeep. This one, you're going to need a swivel, an extension, a little bit of patience to get it out. But it is easier actually to take this bolt out than to remove the entire radiator assembly if you don't need to, because that's quite a bit more work than just this one bolt. If you're taking the radiator out anyways, you're replacing it at the same time, then this is actually, you could just leave this whole fan assembly on, just take the radiator right out. Okay, with the lower bolt removed, all we have left to do is, see this line here? I've already done it, but you need to dislodge it from the fan housing here so that you can lift that out. And there's also this little clip over here that needs to be popped out. Okay, with all 4 bolts disconnected and our tranny lines disconnected underneath, this is going to lift up. And what you have to do is slide it. You have to pull that tab up over the frame and slide it to the side here to get it out. You should be looking at something like this about now. Alright, next thing, we're going to take the serpentine belt off. Your tensioner's right here. 1/2-inch ratchet. Plug right into that square hole there. And you're just going to push down to loosen the belt. And just pull it right off. Alright, we're going to turn our attention back up here to this heater hose. We want to disconnect that. Alright, with the clamp out of the way, we can go ahead and give this a good yank. It might be stuck on there a little bit. Take that off. And we're just going to position that out of the way. Okay, next we're going to take this pulley off here. You're going to use a 1/2-inch socket and a 1/2-inch wrench. And we're going to hold the bolt and just crack them loose. Don't need to take them all the way out yet, just break them loose. And just keep going right around like that. Now when you get to the last one, this one's going to want to turn on you. So what you do for the last one is put your wrench underneath like that to brace against the center of the pulley, and that'll give you enough leverage that you can crack it loose. Then you just take your bolts out. At this point, it should look about something like this. You can go ahead and take all your water pump bolts out now. Okay, once all your bolts are out, the water pump should just fall off. If it doesn't, like this one happens to be siliconed on. Sometimes you'll have that if it's been replaced once already. Just grab a hold of it over here and wiggle it back and forth, and it should just break loose. You're going to have a little bit of antifreeze come out of the motor. That's normal. Just have a catch pan underneath, and we'll just pull that right out. Next, you want to remove any gasket material that's still left behind on the block here. Now, if your water pump bolts look like this, a lot of crud and corrosion in there, take a wire brush, clean all that out of there. You don't want to put them back in like that. Get them as clean as you can. Okay, this part of the pump could be a little tricky to get off. They don't include this with the new pump. It can be purchased separately. They're not too expensive. If it looks like this one here, you're going to probably want to replace it. So it's getting a little old. Check it out real good. This one I know for a fact is just a little ugly looking. It's not very old. I put it on this vehicle not more than a couple of years ago, so I'm going to reuse this one. But give a good grab at it, tug it, pull it. If it breaks, bends, just replace it. It's not worth the time. If you're going to reuse it, it's going to be a 19 millimeter or 3/4, same thing. And putting it in the vise is probably the easiest way to get it loose. If you don't have a vise, crack this loose before you take it off the block, and then you can spin it out. Sometimes they will actually just break right in here, and you just have no choice but to replace it, which is why they're readily available and pretty cheap. Okay, we have our new pump. I rewrapped the threads with some Teflon tape. We're just going to install this into the new pump. Don't clamp your pump too hard in there. You don't want to damage the sealing surface. I have a piece of rubber in here. We're just going to get it kind of hand tight as much as you can turn it down. You don't have to go crazy with it. Just get it close. We'll go back and adjust it later. Let's move back to the truck. Alright, now you don't have to do this, but I like to use a thin coating of gasket maker just on the pump surface. Just real thin. That holds the gasket in place, so when you're putting the water pump back in, it doesn't slip or move and get crushed in there. Just a thin coating. And we can set our gasket into place here. Just press it down so it's stuck on there pretty good. Now when you set this all the way in there, that's about as far as it's going to want to go on. And you'll see there's a little gap right there. So we want to give it a little wiggle, because that's going to fit in there exactly perfect. There. Now we're all the way in. We can tighten the bolts the rest of it. All your bolts are going to be the same length, except for this guy right here is going to be a little bit longer. So when you look at your handful of bolts, you're going to have one that's longer, and he's going to go right in the top there. The rest of them, it doesn't matter where they go. Okay, once you have everything finger tight and you have no gap left in here, we're going to go ahead and use one of these, which is a torque wrench. The spec calls for 9 foot-pounds for the first pass, and then 18 for the second pass. So tighten them to 9. There's plenty of other videos on the internet that show you how to use a torque wrench, so I'm not going to go through that. But definitely want to torque these to spec. Don't just crank them on there because that will cause leaks. You can rent these. They're not too expensive to buy if you don't get a fancy one. Most of your decent mechanics already own one of these. If you're just a backyard guy doing one of these, I'm pretty sure AutoZone, O'Reilly's, those type of places actually rent these. So, okay, we did a 9, and now we're going to do a pass with 18. So we'll turn this up, and we'll just cross hatch the pattern again, just like this: top, bottom, corner, corner, corner. Okay, the pump is on. Okay, now if your pump came with a little rubber band around it like this, you can take it off, you can leave it on, it doesn't matter. This is an electric fan engine, so that's really not needed. Those are threads for a clutch fan. I just usually leave them right on there so it doesn't rust. Doesn't matter, it's your choice. Now this pipe, if you remember, we put it on just kind of sort of close. Now you can see it needs to be tightened a little bit more to line everything up. So we're just going to do that quick. Just turn it a little bit further to get everything lined up just about right in here. There, that looks pretty good. Just about in line with your coil pack is good. Alright, now we're going to put this lower hose back on. Again, check the hose for softness, cracks, hardness, and not replace something that could easily be replaced while you have this all apart. But again, I put the radiator in this not very long ago, about a year ago, so these hoses are still pretty good. What I am going to do is replace this clamp here. These squeeze clamps are supposed to be one-time use. I know a lot of people that reuse them, and it just ends up ending bad in the long run. So we're going to replace that with a traditional worm style clamp while we're in here. Alright, with our new clamp in place, we're going to move on to replacing the thermostat. It's always a good idea to replace the thermostat when you have your coolant system open. I did not replace it when I changed the radiator last time because the radiator was hit in the front end. It wasn't actually a failed part. It just got damaged. So now that we're in here doing the water pump, and the truck did have an open coolant system, stuff leaking out. Since we're in here, it's easy to do. I'm going to do it. It's cheap, it's easy to do. Basically, you're going to disconnect these two hoses and this wire, and then you have two bolts. That one there and one down here. And the housing comes right off. Alright, with the housing and thermostat off, again, you're going to clean up the mating surface real good. I use a little bit of this, it's a Scotch-Brite. It's actually, I think 3M makes it. It's you could buy it at any automotive store. It's actually for doing paint work. It's a very, very fine Scotch-Brite pad. But I find it cleans gaskets off really well, and it does not scratch the crap out of the surface. Alright, now something I wanted to point out. This housing, as you can see, around the edges of the hole are starting to get a little bit of cavitation going on there. That's a pretty common thing with these trucks. When you do a thermostat, they give you a gasket, and I don't use a gasket when I put these back together. I've been doing this for 25 years, and I found that this is a common fail point on these, where they have this aluminum housing on a steel head with corrosive antifreeze going through it. And what happens is you get that pocking there, and if you just have a bare gasket, eventually that cavitates to the point where you start getting a leak. And that can be a big pain. So now what we actually do, what I've been doing for 25 years, and what I've do at my shop is we just use a little of this RTV forma gasket by Permatex. I use ultra black on everything. I don't use any other kind because this is the best you can get. But you can use the red or the blue, whatever is safe for antifreeze. It's a little less expensive if you get the other kind than this kind, but this is what we stock here, so that's what I use. Just anything that's approved for antifreeze, and you're going to put a thin coating on the housing here and let it set for about a good 10 minutes till it starts to get pretty tacky. Alright, while you're waiting for that to set, you can go ahead and clean up your bolts, which are probably pretty grody. Just as before, we're going to wire brush them so they're nice and clean. You can take your new thermostat and get it set in here, and it has a little groove that it sits in. Okay, now we've had a light coating of RTV. It's had a chance to dry for a bit. It's still wet. We don't want to let it dry all the way, but it's pretty tacky at this point. So what we're going to do is make sure any little bits like this, you just clean that out. And we're going to start our bolts into it before we put it onto the block. Like that. Okay, now carefully, we're going to push these down till they're just about flush. Just a little bit sticking out. Now this is the most important part of doing this whole job, is that when you put this on, that doesn't kick out and get pinched in there. Because if it does, it's still going to bolt on and you're not going to know until you're getting leaks and all kinds of other problems. So what you're going to do is position your bolt holes and just go in nice and slow and just get it on there. One clean shot straight on without bumping anything. Push your bolt and just rock it back and forth while you're pushing your bolt here. Carefully just rocking it back and forth slightly until you'll feel the bolt drop in slightly into the hole. So you want to catch a thread. Once you get the two bolts started, you're just going to run them up while holding this tight against here. The RTV should hold it on, but you do not want to let that thermostat slip out. So just run that straight up like that. Now that these new clamps are on, we're going to turn our attention back down to here. We're going to reinstall our idler pulley. Just give it a good spin, make sure it's not loose or clacking or anything like that. Just check it out, make sure it's still okay. This one's good, so we're going to put it back on. Anytime you take anything off, you should just give it a quick inspect to make sure everything looks good there. Okay. Alright, with our belt reinstalled, we can go ahead and drop our fan assembly back into place. You're going to have to use a little bit of patience to get it to square up back in here, because you got to tilt it back and forth to get it around some things here. Okay, we're going to reinstall the 4 bolts for the fan assembly. I'm using a little bit of anti-seize on each one because I'm sure that you might have already found out they don't like to come out too easily, so I'm going to save myself some trouble the next time around with a little bit of anti-seize. Okay, after we have our last bolt in up here, we're going to reinstall our transmission lines into the fan shroud. Alright, after that, you're going to reconnect your fan wire down here and your upper radiator hose, again with a new clamp, not the squeeze clamp style. Alright, and finally the last two things we're going to do is we're going to reconnect the overflow line. It fits in this little groove right here on top of the fan shroud. And you should have a little piece of wire loom right about there that protects it from rubbing on here and here. It's just going to sit right in there like that. There's no clamp on this. It's not under pressure, so that's fine. And then lastly, always firstly, always lastly, we're going to reconnect the battery here. Tighten that up, and then we'll start filling the coolant. Okay, now we're ready to fill the coolant. There's two ways to do this on a Jeep. This 4-liter engine is pretty long, and it tends to get air pockets in it, which will cause you overheating and strife down the line if you're not getting all the air out. So the two best ways to do this is, one, you can purchase a funnel like this. It's specially designed to go on your radiator, and it sits above the engine level to burp all the air out of the system. Or if you don't have one of those, you can just put the truck up on ramps, put coolant in it first, because you don't want to start it empty. But you want to get the truck up on ramps before it runs for too long a period of time, more than a couple minutes, because that's actually going to force this to be the highest point in the system, and that's where the air is going to bubble out. Here's our coolant funnel in action. You can see the air's burping out, the coolant's going down. We don't have to worry about spillage. It's really a great tool. They're not expensive. If you ever plan on doing more than one job involving coolant on any vehicle, I would suggest buying one of these. You can get them at most of your auto parts stores. And they come with adapters for all different vehicles, so you don't have to buy a different adapter for every different vehicle you work on. And that's all you really do, is just fill it up, let it burp out, and just keep filling until you stop getting air out. Okay, between takes we had a bit of a rainstorm here, so I had to pull the front into the garage here. Pennsylvania weather. One minute it's sunny, the next minute it's pouring rain. So yeah, we're gonna let it run a while here. We want to make sure our thermostat opens and our coolant's all circulated. As you can see, it's we're getting some air that's bubbling out. Just run it on nice flat level surface with the funnel installed. If you don't have a funnel, like I said, well, you know, it has to be a sealed funnel, not a regular funnel. It has to have this cap. If you have a regular funnel, just assume that you don't have a funnel. If you're running it on an open radiator, I should say, jack the front end up, pull it up on ramps, or drive it up an incline or something, so that the front of the truck is raised up, because the way the engine sits in here is so long that you see these hoses run down there, any coolant that gets trapped, or air I should say, that gets trapped in the coolant back there, is just going to sit back there if you're not sitting level or inclined upwards. If inclined upwards, the air is going to want to come up to the highest point, which would be the radiator. So that'll save you a lot of time in bleeding the system. Whatever you do, don't just fill it and start driving. You have to bleed the air out. Every vehicle is the same way. You have to get all the air out of the system, because if there's any air in there, you could definitely overheat and damage your engine. Okay, this has been running a good amount of time now, probably about 15-20 minutes. You could just give the upper hose a little squeeze. There's the fan coming back on again. That's good. Still getting little air bubbles out, so we're going to just continue to let it run until we don't get any more air out here. Could sometimes take up to an hour, depending on how much air is in there and how fast it wants to come out. My rule of thumb is, if you can go about 10 minutes and not see any air, it's probably about done. but there's still air coming up, so we're going to continue to wait. Alright, we're going to keep watching our coolant level, make sure that this funnel doesn't go empty, or that if you're just filling it from here, make sure this neck stays full. You don't want to suck big amounts of air in there. And you can kind of feel the upper radiator hose when it starts to get hot and it'll harden up. That's when your thermostat's open. You can actually go and check if you have a gauge, check the heat on the gauge. It should hit right around 210, maybe a little less when the thermostat opens. But we want to run this with the system open, continuing to fill the coolant until that thermostat's open and until our fan has come on. We want to verify everything's working before we seal it up. Alright, we've been running about 40 minutes now. Don't think we're getting any more air out of it, so we can go ahead and cap it up. And what we're going to want to do is, if you have a funnel like this, it comes with this little stick. You just place the stick in there gently, and you're going to just squeeze the upper radiator hose just a bit, just to give it a vacuum, just to take that off. That way it doesn't come spraying out on you when you take it off the top. Open and we're gonna just dump the rest of it in our overflow, like that. Now we can remove our cap and replace it with, be careful because it's going to be pretty hot. Alright, and just clean up your mess, and that's about it. Make sure your overflow is full, which with that little bit we put in there, I'm going to add a little more to it, but that's pretty good there. Thanks for watching, guys. Like our channel and subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks.